Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
Will this be a wave election? One public affairs professor gives his assessment, and we continue our conversation on the constitutional amendments, focusing on the opposition in this week's Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's program. I'm Julie Bartke. In last week's show, we began our conversations on the two constitutional amendments that Minnesotans will vote on in November. This week, we continue that conversation with key lawmakers who oppose both measures. We begin our discussion with this, the amendment that would classify marriage as a union between one man and one woman. Senator Scott Dibble joins me now to talk about why he believes Minnesotans should vote no for the marriage amendment. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you.
Let's begin, Senator, with 31 states in the United States currently have constitutional amendments that ban legal recognition of same-sex unions. So in Minnesota, polling on this issue is close. Most indicate the amendment does have the support to pass at this point. So do you believe still that Minnesota will be the first state to defeat this measure?
Oh, I absolutely do. And actually, I don't think most polls show that it will pass. One poll shows, it's two that have come from the same source, and that particular poll is shown to be fairly deeply flawed. But every other public poll and every other internal poll that I'm familiar with shows a narrow edge for those who are opposed to the amendment. I think Minnesota will be the first one to defeat an amendment like this for a couple of key reasons. First of all, you know, this is Minnesota, and we often are in a position of leading the nation on these issues of really extending freedom and embracing diversity and making sure that everyone has the right to enjoy the freedoms that are guaranteed in their Constitution. We've been that kind of state for many generations now, and something I'm very proud of. It's been you know, just over 18 months since the legislature decided to put this on the ballot, and in that time the coalition that has come together to oppose this really crosses all ideological and political and geographic and demographic boundaries. We see a coalition that's over 600 organizations strong. More than 25% of those are represented by communities of faith. You see Republicans standing up, people from the Independence Party, the Green Party, Democrats, people from big business, from labor, every sector of Minnesota life, folks standing up saying, we have a common set of values in Minnesota. Marriage is fundamentally about commitment and love and responsibility, the ability to protect our families. We have freedoms that are guaranteed in our Constitution. It should not be made illegal to marry the person you love. And in Minnesota, we treat everyone with dignity.
And Senator, there seems to be a lot of information and misinformation out there about what this amendment would or would not do. How would you encapsulate it?
Well, basically what it would do is it would be very hurtful and very divisive, and it would make it illegal to marry the person you love forever. It would forever take away the ability for subsequent generations to have this debate and this discussion in front of the legislature, and it wouldn't create marriage because marriage is currently illegal in our statute books, but it would kind of shut down that conversation. We know that people are beginning to understand fundamentally that their values are supported and affirmed when people are able to form strong families, and it would prohibit that from happening in the future.
And as you just mentioned, it currently is illegal for same-sex marriages in the state of Minnesota. So if this amendment is indeed defeated, what impact do you think there would be if the law remains intact?
Well, you know, that remains to be seen. It's hard to predict. That would have a lot to do with the composition of the legislature. But I definitely believe that the tide of public opinion is moving in a direction that really supports and affirms all families. To have some form of legal relationship to each other, ideally that's marriage, or some, you know, but the ability to further develop other sorts of, just you know, the basic foundation, the economic platform on which we build our families and be able to take that responsibility for each other, protect each other. You know, I think we would see movement in that direction.
Senator, this is of course a very personal issue for you. You are involved in a same-sex marriage. So for you, what does this mean, and how have you been able to absorb the fact that some of the colleagues on your floor feel so, on the Senate floor, feel so polar opposite as you on this issue? Right.
Well, I have to admit, Julie, that it's been painful and it's been very difficult. You know, we are in the legislature, and the issues we work on are about the people we represent and the larger state and the legacy that we leave, and my personal friendships and my personal feelings are really secondary. But in this instance, it's hard, you know, and I'm able typically to reach across the aisle and work with a colleague from another party on this issue and oppose them strenuously on that issue, and that's how the work gets done, and it's based on our relationships, even though our relationships at the end of the day aren't the things that are going into the history books. It's the statutes and the policies and the priorities and the values that we uphold. But this one's been a little more difficult because fundamentally, at its core, I have colleagues, even colleagues who say they support me and Richard in our marriage, who have taken a stand to exclude us entirely from our state's constitution, to exclude us entirely from our ability to enjoy the protection and the benefits of the Constitution, and they don't get to do that. That's guaranteed to me, that's guaranteed to Richard, because we're citizens of this state. And so they're saying that somehow or another we're less worthy, we're secondary. It's very hurtful, it's very painful, and it's kind of a metaphor for exactly what would happen if this constitutional amendment were to pass. It's very divisive. It's saying, I get to vote on your marriage. Well, who wants their marriage voted on? You know, this is not what our state is about.
Those who support the amendment essentially states that it would protect the sanctity of marriage. How important is it to you to have that title, that recognition of marriage, as opposed to, say, civil union? Would you be content with civil union? Well,
my response to that question is, would you want to trade your marriage for a civil union? And would you want your marriage voted on? You know, in every sense of the word, Richard and I have come together because we fell in love and wanted to build a life together and wanted to invite our friends and family into supporting that. My sister just got married on Saturday. And it was an amazing and wonderful and affirming celebration. Richard and I got married 4 years ago. And even though I have the greatest family in the entire world who loves Richard, they love our relationship, and they've been so supportive and so affirming, when we had that opportunity to have that ceremony, you know, that tradition that so many people are familiar with, able to step forward and say, this is who we are, and this is who I love, and we invite you to be a part of it. It was transformative to my family. Suddenly they had a vernacular and an understanding and access to who we were as a couple in our relationship that just simply wasn't present before.
Senator, we are just about out of time, but here's your opportunity to speak to our viewers. And why do you think they should vote no?
Well, if for no other reason, just understanding that voting no affirms and supports the basic values that we all cherish and prize: love, commitment, family, strong communities, freedom guaranteed in our Constitution, and treating each other with dignity the way I would expect to be treated.
Senator Scott Dibble, with those words, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Julie.
Governor Mark Dayton and the Commissioner of the Department of Employment and Economic Development announced new capital investment projects that come from grant dollars from DEED. Now, there were several projects selected, and they were done so following legislative action last session allowing DEED to review projects it deems good for the state.
And I acknowledge that I agreed to this compromise with Republican leaders whose final bonding bills that they would support in the last session were $264 million below my requests. So I saw this Economic Development Fund, $47.5 million, as an opportunity to fund at least some of the excellent projects that would otherwise have been excluded, and it has served that purpose.
All the economists seem to say that publicly funded stadiums don't have much of an economic impact. How is it that the professionals in your department decided that this was going to be a great economic boom?
Well, we took the objective measurements of the number of construction jobs, permanent jobs. Again, leverage of private investment. You know, I believe the owners are putting in $10 million of a $54 million project. So bringing private, you know, that we were all about private leverage, private jobs, and things like that. So you just do the math. It was a highly scoring project. And in addition, the site that they're leaving will be redeveloped for job purposes with the Port Authority, have a strong track record of bringing more jobs in on that end of the project as well. So, you know, everybody wants to focus on baseball, but it was a great community project, and it scored very highly.
Governor, what do you feel about running for re-election, being the governor who will have built 2 stadiums?
Well, you got to look where they're located. You know, my father and my uncles, who built Dayton's department store and turned it into Dayton Hudson, now Target, impressed upon me the importance of downtown revitalization. The natural tendency of economic development is it's a centrifugal process. It goes out from the downtown core. And when that happens unabated, you end up, I remember going with Governor Perpich to Detroit, Michigan a couple decades ago, and here's this concrete, almost abandoned core of the city and everything else moving outside. I mean, it was, and crime rate, the, again, lack of economic vitality. Nobody came downtown. There was no reason. Hudson store there, downtown mainstay closed. So, I mean, you get this downward spiral if you don't put money and effort back into the downtowns.
We continue our discussion on the voter photo ID constitutional amendment with a member who opposes that amendment. Senator Katie Sieben joins me now to talk a little bit about why you think that Minnesotans should vote no on this. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. So, Senator, let's begin with, you've made some compelling arguments in committee last session on why you oppose voter photo ID. So explain why you think Minnesotans should just say no.
I think the main issue is that there's too much ambiguity in the proposed constitutional amendment. We're not sure exactly what the implications will be. For instance, will students be able to use a photo ID from their college along with an electric bill, for instance, that has their address on it to prove their residency to be able to vote? We don't know. The constitutional amendment, if it passes, will be set up for the legislature to determine whether or not that issue, whether students can vote using their college IDs as they can now, will still be in effect. Another example is, will senior citizens in nursing homes be able to use some of the same procedures now to be able to vote if the photo ID amendment passes? It's very unlikely they won't. For instance, right now, many senior homes, the caretakers can vouch for residents of a nursing home. That will no longer be able to occur. So there's just a lot of potential that the amendment, if it passes, will not allow Minnesotans who have the right to vote to be able to vote.
Let's talk a little bit about the language that will be on the ballot. The state Supreme Court recently ruled that that language and the title of voter ID can be provided by the legislature. Now, Justice Alan Page wrote in his dissent that I would conclude that the ballot question on the voting amendment proposed by the legislature is materially and fundamentally deceptive and misleading. Would you agree with this?
I would agree with that. If you look at the actual question that's put before voters, it's substantially different, or it's different, I should say, than the enacting language that, if it's passed, will be written into the Constitution. So one big problem with it is that it says that no one's sure what substantially equivalent voting mechanisms what that actually means. So there's ambiguity between the question before voters and the actual language that will be instituted.
And so do you think then, would you support a measure that states the language that the legislature passes needs to be the language on the ballot, that they need to be one and the same?
The problem is that with election law, and this is, I think, to the heart of the issue of why this should not be going in the state constitution, this is something we could do legislatively. The legislature should work and could work in a bipartisan way to pass election reform that will take care of some of the problems that have been raised in recent years. We have a proven track record of doing that back a couple years ago. The legislature should do that, pass it legislatively, and have Governor Dayton sign it, so that we're not putting things into the Constitution or language into our state constitution that could be, that will be not relevant in decades to come, perhaps.
An argument that's been made consistently throughout this debate has been that voter photo ID disenfranchises certain segments of the population. This argument was actually countered on our program last week by Representative Mary Kiffmeyer. She stated that by offering free IDs to those who typically couldn't afford or have access to one, we're actually enfranchising those segments of the population. Would you agree with this?
No, I mean, that doesn't make sense because, for instance, there was in the Star Tribune this weekend, there was an article about a woman who was born in Mississippi on a farm, and all she has is, after trying to track down a birth certificate, I think to go on a cruise or something, all she could get was some type of certificate of birth that showed she was born along with her brothers and sisters and the date. There's no birth certificate that she has. So under the proposed constitutional amendment, this woman who has been voting for decades has the right to vote in Minnesota. Everyone who knows her acknowledges that she's a citizen, she's a resident of Minnesota and meets all the requirements. She wouldn't be able to get a photo ID and therefore would be disenfranchised.
If this passes, how much responsibility would you say the state has in ensuring that those who might have a difficult time obtaining an ID, like a college student or an elderly person, can get one with relative ease? So how much of the onus is on the state?
I think a tremendous onus is on the state. For instance, if college students, think of a college student, how perhaps they move every semester or every year to a new address. That means that the state of Minnesota taxpayers are going to be on the hook for ensuring that those students can get a valid ID every time they move. Or for instance, if a senior moves to a different nursing home center and doesn't have the means to either get to the DMV or have the means to pay for a new photo identification, that onus, I think, the burden will have to be on the state to get them the documents so that they can vote.
And we're just about out of time, but does this seem like an overwhelming task, in your opinion, to try to get IDs to everybody?
I think one final point that I want to make is that when I touched on earlier that we did see some voting problems in Minnesota, primarily what they were, if the viewers recall, was a case of felons who erroneously voted or who should not have voted. Photo ID won't solve that, because when you show your ID, it doesn't say on your driver's license whether or not you're a felon. So I'm not a felon, but if I was, I could still show my ID and vote, you know, if I wasn't supposed to, because the photo ID won't stop the felon from voting. So there are things that we should do as a legislature. It's incumbent on us as legislators to work on solutions in a bipartisan way to address the real issues at hand. Photo ID doesn't solve those real problems.
Okay, Senator Katie Sieben, we are out of time. Thank you for your perspective on the issue. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
This group of faith-based organizations is weighing in on the voter photo ID amendment and will advocate to defeat the measure. They say it disenfranchises many groups, and any problems with voter verification should be addressed by the legislature.
I think that the more you look at the issue of how you would actually distribute IDs and what the logistics would be, there is a significant cost attached to that. There are no details that have been provided about how that would actually work. There's a lot of work that the legislature did not do before they put this on the ballot. We believe that we really do believe in fair, accessible elections and elections with integrity that allow people to vote who can, and people who can't vote shouldn't. But the answer, solving those problems needs to happen at the legislature, and as far as we're concerned, this was put onto the ballot half-baked. And it should go back to the legislature to solve problems.
We continue our conversation on the 2012 election season with Humphrey Institute professor Larry Jacobs. So, Dr. Jacobs, let's begin with this particular election cycle. Minnesotans will elect a president, a U.S. senator, and members of Congress and state legislators. So, in your opinion, do you think people are going to go in and research the candidates and the issues prior to getting into the election booth? Or do you think that essentially whoever they vote for president will dictate the party of votes down the line?
It's going to vary. You're going to have some people, perhaps 3/4 or so, who are just going to do a party line vote. We've got a whole bunch of Hatfield and McCoys out here who are Democrats and Republicans, and they just vote straight ticket. So the big question that rises is who's going to turn out and vote.
Is that still the case, or do you find that that's diminishing a bit with?
We have seen evidence that the straight ticket voting has increased over time as polarization has increased both in our state capitals but also in Washington. We're seeing voters not quite as polarized as what we're seeing in our elected officials, but they're more polarized.
Let's talk about the 2 constitutional amendments that are on the ballot. How do you think they're going to impact voter turnout and perhaps even election results?
Very interesting. You know, you look at the way the election's playing out, and at this point, it looks as if Mitt Romney is not going to be making a major investment in time or money in Minnesota. At this point, the polls show the Democratic incumbent U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar far ahead of her challenger. And if that continues, it may diminish some of the motivation for Republicans to turn out and vote, except the constitutional amendments. Particularly the same-sex marriage constitutional amendment may mobilize some of those more conservative or Republican-leaning voters to turn out and cast their ballots. So those amendments could be quite important.
74% of constitutional amendments since 1974 have been approved by voters. So given the polling, what do you think the outcome of each amendment would be? Do you care to speculate?
You know, my sense at this point is that both amendments will pass. We've got the historic record, which is overwhelmingly that the amendments do carry. And then we've got polling data on each amendment, which generally shows support for how they're being presented in the actual amendment language.
Dr. Jacobs, Minnesota historically has a very high percentage of voter turnout. So given what we see on the ticket this year, do you expect the same?
I do expect very high turnout. I think it's going to matter, though, who turns out. In 2010, we saw pretty good turnout, but there was a drop-off in turnout among more Democratic or Democratic-leaning voters. And the result was that the legislature shifted into the Republican column, both the House and the Senate. And what was interesting is, this is very important, the majorities rest on very small numbers. For instance, in the House, the majorities won in 2010 are based on about 600 votes. So it doesn't take a whole lot of change in terms of who turns out, and particularly if there would be a drop-off in Republican turnout, to have a major impact on those legislative races. I think turnout will be high, but I do think there's a chance that the turnout among Republicans might dip a bit, particularly if presidential candidate Mitt Romney doesn't invest in Minnesota and Amy Klobuchar goes on to a pretty significant win.
You've been doing this for a really long time. I'd like to get a sense of what you think, how you would categorize and encapsulate this particular election cycle. Do you think we're at a crossroads? Do you think this is one of the most important elections in this generation?
You know, almost every election you come around to, and you can see why it's important. And this is an important election. I do think the issues that are being framed and the very significant differences between the parties presents a bit of a crossroads. Whichever party is elected, they've got a very clear path that they're going to take the country in, and they're pretty different. So it is a significant election, and I think it'll be one of those elections that could well be thought back on as a crossroads. Here in Minnesota, on the national level, for instance, health reform is very much in the balance. One party says full steam ahead for implementing health reform after the Supreme Court's ruling upholding it. Another party said, let's repeal it. Those are pretty big differences.
What do you think the undecided voter should look for between now and November?
Well, we're going to spend a lot of money, perhaps over $1 billion, maybe quite a bit more than $1 billion in advertising. Both party organizations and campaigns are going to put a lot of money into reaching out to voters. And the truth is, a lot of that is targeted on a very small number of folks who are genuinely undecided. I think the key issue for undecided voters is to pay attention. As a generalization, the undecided voters tend to be less interested in politics and less knowledgeable. And I think this is one of those years where you want to kind of sit up and see if you can figure out where the candidates stand. Not what your impression is, but where their position really is on some of these big issues related to taxing and spending and health reform and the direction of our foreign policy.
Have you ever seen anything quite like this with all of the different tentacles that are out there, particularly statewide with the amendments and as many seats that are up for grabs as are?
There's a lot at stake in this election. I think there's no doubt that we've got some big choices in front of us. But I'm not sensing at this point what I would describe as a wave election. If you think back over the last few election cycles, 2006 and 2008 were wave elections that went in the Democrats' favor. The 2010 election was a wave election that went in the favor of Republicans, and we saw Republicans in Minnesota, for instance, win the Minnesota Senate for the first time in decades, along with picking up the House. I don't see that as likely this time around. It seems as if voters are more mixed. It's going to be a very close national race for the presidency. Minnesota, I think, will have some close legislative races as well, and congressional races. So it seems more that the candidates and the issues they stand on could be more important this year than what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 cycles.
Dr. Larry Jacobs, we are out of time, but it'll be fascinating to get you back after the elections and we can talk about some of the results and the trends.
Good to be with you.
This group unveiled a plan that targets early prevention as one component of the Minnesota State Substance Abuse Strategy. The plan is the first of its kind, a multi-agency approach to decrease substance abuse while increasing public safety and investing in prevention.
The federal government estimates that for every dollar spent on effective school-based prevention programs, we save an estimated $18 in subsequent problems later in life. And the National Institute on Drug Abuse estimates that every dollar we invest in substance abuse treatment yields a return of up to $12 in reduced drug-related crime, criminal justice, and healthcare costs.
So there was a famous study published in the journal Addiction. It's called Mesa Grande. It's very easy to find. It comes from the University of New Mexico. It was a very simple clinical question. What works and what doesn't work for treatment of alcohol use disorders? They looked at 50 years of treatment literature. They found 350 studies that met their inclusion criteria. And then they looked at effectiveness and put the interventions in rank order from most effective to least effective. They found 46 discrete interventions and put them in order. At the very bottom, 46 out of 46 was just general education. Doesn't tend to work. Not far up above general education is highly punitive measures. They don't tend to work. The stuff at the top, number 1 and number 2, is something called brief intervention and motivational interviewing. Brief intervention gets back to this screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment stuff that we're talking about. It's a way of delivering a treatment in, say, a primary care setting that's going to be highly impactful. And the way to do that brief intervention is with a psychotherapy or a cognitive approach called motivational interviewing. These are very effective ways, been demonstrated through a vast amount of evidence to be very effective.
And that wraps up this week's program. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartke. Thank you for watching Capitol Report.